Episode 262, A Questionable Proposal. Charles and Debbie looked at each other. Neither of them trusted Rufus. "Debbie, come back with me. Your grandfather misses you very much." Rufus approached Debbie as he spoke. Alex stepped in front of her. He didn't know what Rufus might do. Rufus was displeased, but he was so afraid of Alex that he didn't dare to protest. He just looked at Debbie anxiously. "Debbie," he said, "don't you want to see your real home? Where your mother lived? Your grandfather hasn't seen you in 20 years. He misses you very much. Yesterday, I showed him your picture. I've never seen him cry like that." At the mention of her mother, Debbie was reminded what Charles had told her about Cynthia's death. Her anger erupted as she stared at Rufus. "You killed my mother! I hate you!" After this outburst, her eyes turned red and watery. She lowered her head and started crying. "What kind of people are you?" she whispered as she sobbed. "You were her family. Why would you kill her?" In Debbie's mind, her mother's death might be understandable if a stranger had been responsible. But it had been her own father, Debbie's grandfather. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked herself. "Kill my own grandfather to avenge my mother?" "Debbie, there were reasons why those things happened," Rufus answered. "As you said yourself, we're family. We would never hurt you. Your mother was my sister, and I loved her." What does he mean by that? Debbie thought. There must be some secret, something he's not telling me. "Will you come home with me?" Rufus asked again, in a voice that sounded truly caring. "You've been away for 20 years. If you go back and see your grandfather, he'll be very happy." "Fine," Debbie answered calmly. "I'll go back with you." She had made up her mind. She had to meet Jessup Clifton face to face and ask him what this was all about. "That's great," Rufus exclaimed happily. "We'll go back then." "But you won't send anyone after my father again," Debbie continued. "If you do, I'll never forgive you, and I'll avenge both him and my mother." She didn't trust Rufus. If she went with him, he might still send someone to kill her father, so that she would have nowhere to go. "I promise," Rufus said solemnly after thinking for a moment. The only reason he had wanted Charles dead was to make it easier to take Debbie home. If she came willingly, there was no reason to go after Charles. "Debbie, I'll go with you," Alex said. The four Moon Girls agreed. "We'll go where Mr. Alex goes," Celeste insisted. Despite his fear of him, Rufus was very happy to have Alex come along. He would be quite useful if he could be made part of the family. However, when Alex reached out and held Debbie's hand, his worries returned. "Alex, I'd appreciate it if you gave us some space." "Alex, I'd appreciate it if you gave us some space." Alex was a little puzzled, but then he understood that Rufus felt threatened by his closeness with Debbie. He let go of her hand. Mr. Clifton, please understand. Today is our wedding day, and you're part of the family. I'd be honored if you'd witness our marriage." "Yes," said Reginald, who saw an opportunity to relieve some of the tension. "Alex, you should exchange rings and kiss each other again, and then you'll be officially married." "No," Rufus protested. "The Cliftons are a proud family, and we do things our own way. None of us can get married without the family's consent. Right now, that's impossible for you. I hope you understand." He turned to Debbie. "Debbie, you can't marry him today. When we go back to Baltimore, I'll take you to see your grandfather and we'll see what he says." "All right then," said Alex. "Debbie, we'll go to Baltimore and talk with your grandfather." Debbie seemed to have been swayed by Rufus's argument, so there was no use arguing. She nodded in agreement. Rufus breathed a long sigh of relief, and then looked over at the other wedding guests. "I'll remember everyone who was here tonight. If I hear gossip spreading about what happened here, or the things we talked about, it will be very bad for all of you. Understood?" "Yes," Reginald answered. Everyone in the room nodded in agreement. Rufus turned back to Debbie. "Debbie, you go and rest. I'll meet you here in the morning and we'll go back to Baltimore together." Then he signaled to Paul, Tim, and Andy, and the four of them left. Once Rufus had gone, Reginald, David, Charles, and Lindsay walked over to Alex and thanked him. David was particularly grateful that Alex had saved his life. "Thank you, Alex," he said. "If you hadn't been here, my father and I might have been killed." His eyes were filled with admiration. "Don't mention it," Alex said with a smile. Reginald was starting to feel as if his presence was unwanted, and that the Marvels must have a lot to talk about. He said goodbye to them, turned around, and left with David. "Debbie, do you really want to go back with the Cliftons?" Charles asked when they were alone. There was sadness in his eyes. "Maybe you should just run away from here." Debbie shook her head slowly and smiled. "Dad, they found me here. If I tried to run, where could I go? I just want to go to the place where my mother lived. Don't worry about me. I don't believe that Jessup would harm his own grandchild." Charles nodded his head in silence, but he and Lindsay both thought that what Debbie and Alex were doing was very dangerous. However, he realized that it was their decision to make, and he decided to give them some time alone to discuss it. He suggested that everyone else should go back to their rooms. Everyone went to get some rest. A room in the house had been arranged for the Moon Girls, and though they were reluctant to leave Alex, they also said goodnight and went to get some sleep. Alex and Debbie were finally alone. "So, we're going to see your grandfather tomorrow," Alex said and took Debbie's hand. "Are you nervous?" He saw that she was frowning, and he worried about her. "I don't know what I'll say to him," Debbie answered. She didn't know how to feel. "My mother died because of him. I hate him so much." "It's okay. I'll support you whatever you want to do." Alex gently pulled Debbie's hand toward him, and she rested her head against his chest. Her earrings scratched him, and he winced slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes, I'm fine." He looked down at their clothes and smiled. "So, we've had half a wedding. I'm starting to think it's just not going to happen. Are we the worst couple in the world? Debbie blushed. No one's stopping you now. We can do whatever we want. Alex smiled at her and took out his ring. She also took out hers, and they placed them on each other's fingers. He stared into her eyes. They twinkled like stars. She had never been more beautiful to him. He slowly put his face close to hers and kissed her cherry red lips. It was the sweetest kiss either of them had ever had. It was like drinking the finest honey, and Alex felt as if he was soaring among the clouds. He slowly released her and looked into her face. He was blushing so hard that his entire face was scarlet. In her eyes, he glimpsed the possibility of endless joy and contentedness with life. Then, he suddenly felt an intense sense of pride that she was his. Debbie, you're my wife, he blurted out. Yes, she whispered and lowered her head. The whole idea made her feel a little shy. And what am I? He asked. She wanted to call him husband, but she hesitated. They were not yet married, and there was still her family to deal with. You're Alex, she answered. No, he said and smiled. When I call you my wife, you can't just call me by my name. He knew why she was hesitating, but he felt he had to encourage her. In his mind, they were already married. His prodding worked. You're my husband, she whispered. Alex happily agreed. He grabbed Debbie and lifted her up off the floor. What are you doing? She asked. She was startled. Let me down. This is what husbands do. Debbie laughed and cried for him to put her down. Look at you all scared, Alex said and put her down. Are you in a better mood now? It's getting a little late. Let me show you to your room and then I'll go to the guest room. Alex accompanied Debbie back to her room and said goodnight. She lay down on the bed, thinking about how happy she felt when Alex spun her in his arms. She couldn't help but smile. When she turned over and looked at the other side of the bed, she fantasized that he was lying there. Yes, we're already husband and wife, she murmured. She smiled and imagined she was talking to him. When she thought that they still had their wedding night to look forward to, she felt so embarrassed that she closed her eyes and tried to go to sleep right then and there. The next day, Rufus picked them up at 9 o'clock in the morning. Apparently, he had managed to replenish his security since the day before. Charles and Lindsay saw them off at the main gate. After they had said their goodbyes, Alex and Debbie got in the back of Rufus's car, while the Moon Girls got into another. They drove to the airport. Rufus had already made the arrangements. The flight left around lunchtime and arrived in Baltimore at 2 in the afternoon. When they got out of the airport, there were cars waiting for them. They were all set to go straight to the Clifton family mansion, while Paul was sent to stay somewhere else. Paul hadn't slept for the entire night, and he wouldn't stop shaking his head. His defeat by Alex had been a great blow to him. They drove for a long time through heavy traffic before they passed onto a relatively quiet street with trees planted on both sides of the road. The houses looked like they were all hundreds of years old. They were all black or red brick houses, and their worn-down facades bore silent witness to their long and fascinating histories. The car stopped in front of a tall, bright red door. On its surface was placed a large golden plaque that said, Clifton Manor.